My name is Nora Callum. I'm 30 years old. And the morning my cousin Bev forwarded me a group chat I had never been included in was when I finally understood that the people who claim to protect a family are sometimes the ones most determined to decide who belongs in it. The message came through at 7:22 on a Saturday in April. Bev had meant to forward it to her sister. She sent it to me instead, with a note that said only, "Heads up about the sale." The chat was titled Family, Dad's Things. I was not a member of it. The message thread showed 11 days of planning I had not been part of. Lists, logistics, a date, an appraiser's name, a hauler contact, the names of 2 antique dealers who had already been given a preview of the workshop contents. My mother's most recent message in the thread, sent the night before, read, "We move fast before she asks questions." I read the thread twice, from the bottom up. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen table and sat with my coffee for a few minutes. Through the window above the sink, I could see the neighbor's yard, where a sprinkler was making its slow arc across the grass in the early morning quiet. Then I picked up my phone and called a man named Arthur Bellew. Arthur Bellew was the estate attorney my father had retained 9 years earlier, when my father was 56 and had received a diagnosis that his cardiologist, a physician named Dr. Miriam Selby, described as serious but manageable, and which my father had received with the particular stillness of a man who has spent his life building things and understands that building things requires planning. Arthur Bellew had prepared my father's trust. My father had named me as trustee. Arthur Bellew had the document. He had been holding it for 9 years, since I was 21 years old, waiting for the moment it would be needed. I told Arthur Bellew what I had seen in the forwarded chat. I told him the sale was scheduled for the following Saturday. I said 4 words, "Freeze everything, I'm trustee." Arthur Bellew said he would send the letters that morning. What none of the people in that group chat knew, not my mother, not my Aunt Carol, not my cousin Danny, who had apparently spent 11 days coordinating the hauler and the antique dealers, was that my father had made his decision 9 years ago and filed it at the county and said almost nothing about it to anyone except me, and that the sale they were planning for a Saturday in April was not theirs to plan. I want to tell you how we got there, because the forwarded chat was not the beginning. It was the moment 11 days of planning ran into 9 years of preparation. My father built things. This is the most accurate way I know to describe him, and it encompasses more than it might seem to. He built furniture in the workshop behind the house on Crestwood Drive, a detached 2-car garage he had converted over the years into a proper woodworking space, with a dust collection system and organized tool walls and a workbench along the north side that he had constructed himself from reclaimed oak. He built the lake cabin on Aldine Lake from a shell structure he had purchased for $38,000 when I was 11 years old, driving out on weekends and sometimes taking me with him, so that I spent a significant portion of my childhood watching a man with a measuring tape and a specific vision for how things ought to fit together. He built his business from a single route to a regional distribution operation with 14 employees and contracts across 4 counties. He built relationships with precision, not many of them, but the ones he built were load-bearing. He built, in the last decade of his working life, a careful accounting of what he had made and what he wanted to happen to it. My mother organized things. This is also accurate, and it is not a criticism. She managed the logistics of the household with the efficiency of someone who had, over 35 years of marriage, developed systems for everything. Schedules, appointments, the social architecture of the family, who went where and when and what was expected of them. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The difficulty was that managing the logistics of a household and understanding the legal structure of an estate are not the same skill, and my mother had never fully distinguished between them. My mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, was her closest confidant and her most reliable ally in all organizational matters. Carol was 3 years older than my mother, divorced, and had the specific authority in the family that comes from being the older sibling who has survived something, in Carol's case, a difficult marriage and its aftermath, and has emerged with strong opinions and the willingness to voice them. Carol had been present at every major family decision for as long as I could remember, usually positioned just behind my mother's shoulder, confirming whatever my mother had already decided. I was the only child. This is relevant because it meant that every assumption about who would inherit, who would manage, who would continue the things my father had built rested entirely on how the family understood me, and how the family understood me had been shaped, over years, by a particular narrative that had little to do with what I actually knew or could do. The narrative was, Nora is sensitive. Nora takes things hard. Nora needs to be managed carefully, or she becomes difficult. This narrative had originated, as near as I can reconstruct it, from a period in my mid-teens when I had gone through a stretch of genuine difficulty, a year of poor academic performance, a conflict with my mother that had lasted several months and left residue. My mother had managed that period by managing me, by controlling the information I received, by making decisions in advance of telling me about them, by treating my potential reaction as a variable to be minimized rather than a response to be engaged with. I was 15. The strategy was perhaps understandable. What was less understandable was that the strategy had never been updated. I was 30 years old, with a degree in financial planning and 4 years of experience as an associate at a wealth management firm, and my mother still made decisions about family matters by calculating how to present them to me after the fact in a way that would minimize friction. She had been doing this for 15 years. It had become, by the time my father died, so natural to her that she did not think of it as a strategy at all. It was simply how things worked. Carol helped her plan, and Nora was informed when the plan was settled. What she had never counted for was my father. My father had his first cardiac event when I was 21, and he was 56. He survived it. Dr. Miriam Selby at the Regional Cardiac Center managed his recovery with precision and set him up with a monitoring protocol and a set of lifestyle modifications that he followed without complaint and with the methodical compliance of someone who understands that compliance is the only variable he controls. After the event, he called Arthur Bellew. He did not tell my mother he was calling Arthur Bellew. He told me this later, that he had made the appointment on a Tuesday afternoon while my mother was at Carol's and had driven himself to Arthur Bellew's office on Crescent Street and had spent 3 hours describing what he had built and what he wanted to happen to it. He said he had thought carefully about who should hold the trustee role. He said he needed someone who would read the documents, someone who understood financial instruments, someone who would not be managed by my mother's organizational energy when there were decisions that required something other than logistics. He said my name. I was 21. I had 1 year of a financial planning degree behind me and no professional credentials. I was not yet the person he was describing. He was naming who he believed I was becoming, and he was filing the paperwork for that person 9 years before she would be needed. He told me about the trust on a Sunday afternoon at the lake cabin, the autumn after his cardiac event. We were sitting on the dock with the lake flat and gray in the October light, and he handed me a copy of the key trust provisions he had written out by hand on 3 pages of yellow legal paper, with Arthur Bellew's contact information at the bottom. He said, "I don't need you to understand all of this right now. I need you to keep it and know who to call." I kept it. I transferred the yellow pages to a document sleeve in the fireproof safe I bought when I moved into my first apartment. Over the 9 years that followed, I built the understanding my father had anticipated, finished the degree, passed the CFP examination on my first attempt, joined Halloran Wealth Management as an associate, worked 4 years of client estate reviews and trust administration cases that made the language of my father's trust as readable to me as anything I touched at work. I did not tell my mother about the trust. My father had not told her, and I understood, without his needing to explain it, why he had not. My mother would have managed the information. She would have incorporated it into her logistics. The trust would have become another thing she organized around, another variable she accounted for in her planning, until the planning and the trust and the accounting were all blended together in a way that served her systems rather than my father's intentions. My father understood his wife. He loved her and he understood her, and he had spent 9 years making sure that what he had built would be protected by someone she could not, without realizing it, manage into compliance. He died in the February of the year I turned 30. The second cardiac event was faster than the first. Dr. Selby had told him, at a monitoring appointment 8 months earlier, that the underlying condition had progressed in ways she wanted him to know about plainly. My father had received this information the way he received most information, without visible reaction, with a set of specific follow-up questions, and with a private rearrangement of his understanding of the time he had. He called me after that appointment. He did not call to discuss medical details. He called to tell me that he had spoken to Arthur Bellew the previous month and reviewed the trust documents, and that everything was current, and that Arthur Bellew had my contact information and would reach out to me directly when the time came. He said, "You know what to do." I said I did. He died 11 days after the February conversation. I am not going to describe here, because it belongs only to the people who were in the room and does not belong in this story. What belongs in this story is what happened after. Arthur Bellew called me the morning after my father's death, before 9 o'clock, as he had told me he would. He confirmed that the trust was active. He confirmed that the assets it covered, the workshop and its contents, the lake cabin, the business interest, and the contents of 2 financial accounts my father had held separately from the joint household accounts, had transferred to the trust at my father's death. He said he would send me the full documentation by courier that day. The documentation arrived at 4 in the afternoon. I read it that evening, at my kitchen table, with the particular attention of someone reading a document she has been preparing to read for 9 years. My mother called me twice that evening. I answered both calls. We spoke about the immediate logistics, the funeral arrangements that Carol had already begun organizing, the family members who needed to be notified, the specific and necessary details of the first days after a death. We did not speak about the estate. My mother did not raise it, which I understood to mean she was planning to raise it later, on her own timeline, with Carol's help, in whatever form she had already begun to organize it. I said I would be at the house the next morning. I said to let me know if she needed anything that night. She said she would be fine. Carol was there. The 11 days between my father's death and Bev's forwarded message were the 11 days of planning I was not part of. I learned the shape of those 11 days in pieces, over the following weeks, from sources that were not my mother, from Bev, who had been recruited to help organize the workshop tool inventory and felt increasingly uncomfortable about what she was helping organize, from a woman named Ida Grange, who ran the estate sale company my mother had engaged and who called me 2 days after Arthur Bellew's letters arrived because she had received one of them, from the 2 antique dealers, brothers named Marcus and Pete Calloway, who had been given a preview walkthrough of the workshop and who contacted me through a mutual acquaintance when word reached them that the sale had been placed on hold. My mother, with Carol's organizational support, had moved in the first 48 hours. She had engaged Ida Grange and her company, who specialized in estate liquidations and had a standard process for inventorying, pricing, and selling household and workshop contents. She had pulled my father's truck from the workshop and staged the space for the preview. She had made preliminary inquiries with a real estate agent named Frank Delacroix about the lake cabin. Not yet a listing, she had told Frank Delacroix, but a conversation about timing. She had not contacted Arthur Bellew. She had not pulled the trust documents, which were on file with the county. She had not, in 11 days of detailed and efficient planning, done the one thing that would have told her that the assets she was planning to liquidate were not hers to liquidate. The structural reason for this was not malice. My mother had been managing family logistics for 35 years without encountering a document that constrained her management. The household accounts were joint. The house on Crestwood Drive was joint property. The decisions of the marriage had been made jointly, with my mother's organizational capacity as the engine. She had no framework for an asset that sat outside that structure. She planned the estate sale the way she had planned everything else, efficiently, thoroughly, and with Carol confirming each step. What she had no framework for was the possibility that my father had, 9 years ago, made a decision she was not part of. Arthur Bellew's letters went to 3 parties: Ida Grange at the estate sale company, Frank Delacroix at the realty office, and my mother directly. The letters were formal and precise in the way that Arthur Bellew's communications always were. They identified the trust, identified me as trustee, stated that the assets under discussion were trust property, and notified each recipient that no sale, transfer, listing, or disposition of trust assets could proceed without trustee authorization. Ida Grange called me the morning she received the letter. She was professional and matter-of-fact. She said she had seen trust situations before and understood the constraint. She said she had placed the estate sale on hold and had notified the antique dealers. She said she was sorry for my loss and that she was available if I wanted to discuss the inventory at a future point. Frank Delacroix sent a brief acknowledgement email to Arthur Bellu's office and did not follow up further. My mother called me at 11 o'clock on the Monday morning the letters arrived. I was at my desk at Halloran Wealth, in the middle of a client review that my manager, a thorough woman named Beth Oregon, had agreed to let me attend remotely rather than in person given the circumstances. I stepped away from the screen to take the call. My mother's voice had a quality I recognized, the controlled precision of someone who has planned carefully and encountered an obstacle that was not in the plan. She asked me what Arthur Bellu's letter meant. I said it meant that the assets my father had placed in trust couldn't be sold or transferred without my authorization as trustee. She asked when your father had done this. I said 9 years ago. A silence. Not long. My mother did not sit with silences the way my father had. She moved through them. She said she didn't understand why he hadn't told her. I said I thought he had wanted to make sure the assets were handled according to his wishes, and that he had trusted me to do that. She said, "And what are your wishes?" I said I didn't know yet. I said I had the full trust documentation, and I was reviewing it carefully, and that I would be in touch with her once I had a clear picture of what the trust's terms required and what decisions I needed to make. She said, "How long would that take?" I said I wasn't sure. A few weeks at minimum. Possibly longer for some decisions. She said Carol had already committed to being in town through the end of the month to help with the estate. I said I understood, and that I appreciated Carol's help with the aspects of the estate she could assist with, and that for the trust assets I would be working through Arthur Bellu's office. There was another silence. Then my mother said she needed to talk to Carol, and that she would call me later. I said that was fine. I said I was sorry, again, for what we were all going through, and that I wanted to handle this in a way that honored what Dad had built. She said she hoped so. She ended the call. I went back to the client review. Beth Oregon, who had heard only my side of the call through the half-open door of the small office I was using, asked afterward if everything was okay. I said it was a family matter, and that I was handling it. She nodded and moved on to the next item on the agenda. I was at work for 3 more hours. I did not think about my mother or the trust or the workshop for those 3 hours. I reviewed a client's portfolio reallocation with the attention it required and answered 2 emails and attended a brief staff meeting about a systems update that was rolling out the following week. This is what I mean when I say I knew what to do. My father had named me trustee not because I was his daughter, but because he had watched me, over years, develop the specific capacity to hold difficult things without letting the difficulty reorganize my attention. He had seen it in me before I had fully seen it in myself. By the time the moment arrived, I had been practicing for 9 years. The sale date came and went on the Saturday in April. Ida Grange confirmed, as a professional courtesy, that her team had not been on site. The driveway at Crestwood Drive was quiet. A neighbor, a retired teacher named Ruth Callan, who had known my father for 20 years, texted me that morning to ask if the sale had been postponed. I said it had been, and that I would let her know when there was any news about the workshop contents. Ruth Callan texted back, "Your dad would be glad someone's thinking it through." I read that message twice. Then I put my phone in my bag and went for a walk. The weeks that followed the Saturday were the weeks in which my mother and I negotiated, through Arthur Bellu and a separate attorney my mother retained, a general practitioner named Stephen Holt, the structure of what would happen to the trust assets. These were not warm conversations. They were not hostile ones either. They were the conversations of 2 people who understood that they were in a process with defined terms and that the terms were not going to shift based on either person's preference. My mother wanted the workshop content sold, the lake cabin listed and sold, the business interest liquidated, and the proceeds incorporated into the joint estate she was administering. This was consistent with how she had understood the estate before the trust letters arrived, and it was not an unreasonable position on its face. A reasonable person could look at my father's assets and conclude that the most sensible path was conversion to cash. What my mother had not accounted for was that the trust had specific terms about how each asset was to be handled, and that those terms reflected my father's actual wishes rather than a reasonable interpretation of what he might have wanted. The business interest, for instance, had a succession plan. My father had a minority partner named Gordon Mace, who had worked with him for 11 years and had a right of first refusal on my father's share under the terms of their partnership agreement, an agreement that Arthur Bellew had incorporated into the trust structure. Gordon Mace exercised that right within 3 weeks of my father's death. The transaction was handled between Arthur Bellew and Gordon Mace's attorney, a woman named Philippa Ward. The proceeds, $214,000, transferred to the trust account. The workshop contents were a different matter. My father's trust specified that tools and equipment he had designated as built to last, a list he had actually prepared, in his handwriting, as an exhibit to the trust, were to be offered first to specific individuals he had named: a neighbor who had learned woodworking from him, a former employee, a cousin who had expressed interest in the hobby. The remaining contents could be sold, but through a process Arthur Bellew's office would oversee. Ida Grange, once I explained the constraint, said she was willing to work within it and that she had handled donor specification situations before. The lake cabin was the longest conversation. My mother raised the cabin in our 4th phone call, 6 weeks after my father's death. She said Frank Delacroix had a potential buyer, not yet a formal approach, but a family who had expressed interest in the property. She said the timing was good and that the proceeds would go a long way towards securing her financial position over the next decade. I said I understood her position. I said the cabin was covered by the trust and that any sale required my authorization. She asked if I was going to authorize it. I said I needed time to review the trust's terms regarding the cabin specifically and to consult with Arthur Bellew about whether a sale at this point was consistent with what my father had intended. She said she had been patient. I said I knew she had and that I appreciated it.
She said, "How much more time?"
I said 30 days from today. There was a silence on the line. 30 days was not the answer she was expecting. She had been anticipating, I think, a shorter timeline, a week, perhaps 2. She said she didn't understand why it would take 30 days. I said because I wanted to be certain I was making the right decision and that the trust obligated me to act as a fiduciary for the assets under my management, which meant I couldn't move quickly on a decision of this size just because the timing was convenient for someone else's plan. She did not answer immediately. Then she said she would tell Frank Delacroix that the timeline was uncertain. I said that was the accurate thing to tell him. She ended the call. I spent those 30 days doing what I had said I would do. I reviewed the trust terms for the cabin carefully. The document was specific about my father's preference that it remain in family use for as long as that was practical, and that a sale, if one became necessary, should be at full market value through a formal listing process rather than an off-market transaction. I discussed the terms with Arthur Bellew. I requested a formal market valuation from a certified appraiser named Leonard Foss, whose assessment came in at $287,000, $41,000 above what Frank Delacroix had indicated the interested family was prepared to offer. At the end of 30 days, I called my mother and told her my decision. I said the cabin could be listed for sale, consistent with the trust's terms, through a formal listing process with a licensed agent, at a list price reflecting the appraised value. I said the off-market transaction Frank Delacroix had been exploring was not consistent with the trust's fiduciary standard, and I was not going to authorize it. She said she understood. She authorized Frank Delacroix to proceed with a formal listing. The cabin was listed at $284,900. It sold 9 weeks later to a family from the city who had been looking in the area for 2 years. The closing was handled by Arthur Bellew's office. The proceeds transferred to the trust account on a Tuesday in September. On the Wednesday, I drove out to the lake. I parked in the same spot my father had always used, the pull-off between the 2 birch trees at the edge of the property. The new owners had not yet taken possession. Closing had been the day before. I walked down to the dock and stood there for a while. The lake was the same in September as it had been in October when I was 21, flat and gray in the morning light, the tree line on the far shore just beginning to show color. I thought about the 3 pages of yellow legal paper he had handed me on this dock 9 years ago. I thought about Arthur Bellew's voice on the phone at 7:22 on a Saturday morning, precise and ready. I thought about Leonard Foss's appraisal report sitting in my document safe alongside the trust copy, everything filed and current and correct. Then I drove home. There is something that happens when a person discovers, later than they should have, that a structure existed which they had not known about and could not have changed. The discovery does not produce a clean response. For my mother, it produced something I can only describe by its physical signs: a new deliberateness in her speech when we talked about the estate, a pause before she answered questions that she would previously have answered immediately. She was working something out. I did not know exactly what. I did not think it was mine to know. Carol went home at the end of April, 2 weeks later than planned. She and I did not speak directly about the trust, but she said something to me at the door the last time I was at my mother's house before she left, when my mother was in the other room. She said my father had always known what he was doing. She said it flatly, without particular warmth or coldness, the way someone states a fact they've been circling for a while. I said I thought so too. Gordon Mace sent me a note, 3 months after the business transfer closed, saying that the operation was running well and that he thought of my father every day. He said my father had been precise about everything he touched. I wrote back and said I knew. I said the precision was the thing I was most grateful for. The trust closed in the winter of the year I turned 31. Arthur Bellew filed the final accounting with the county. The trust had administered 3 asset classes over 9 months, with documented decisions at each step that I kept in a binder in my filing cabinet alongside the yellow legal pages, which I had transferred from the document sleeve to a protective cover a year after he died. The handwriting is his. I do not read it often. I know what it says. There is something clarifying about being the person who holds the document. Not powerful. That is not the right word.
Clarifying.
You can see, from that position, the difference between the people who plan with the assets and the people who plan for them. My mother had spent 35 years planning with my father's work, incorporating it, organizing around it, ensuring it served the household efficiently. My father had spent the last 9 years of his life planning for it, for what it was, for what he wanted it to become, for who he trusted to carry that intention forward when he could not. He filed the trust on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 9 years before it was needed. He handed me yellow legal paper on a dock in October and said you know who to call. He did not make a speech about it. He built the structure and put my name in it and went back to the workshop. There is a kind of love in that, not demonstrative, not announced, but load-bearing in the way that the things he built were load-bearing. The kind that holds when it needs to hold. If you have a person in your life who builds that way, who makes the call, files the document, puts your name on the thing without a speech, I want to ask you something specific. On that Saturday in April, when the estate sale date came and went and not one item left the driveway, there were people who had planned for 11 days to be there that morning. My mother, Carol, Danny with his hauler contact. And none of them showed up because Arthur Bellew had sent 3 letters. If you had been one of them, if you had spent 11 days planning and then received a letter that stopped everything, at what point do you think you would have understood that the planning had always been built on a foundation that was never actually there? If this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribe so you don't miss what's next. And if you know someone who quietly holds the documents, who files things and says little and trusts that the structure will speak when it needs to, send this to them. They'll understand exactly what my father meant by those 3 pages of yellow legal paper.